What would you do if you inherited a house and discovered that the previous owners had been hiding something unspeakable in the walls for nearly a century? Today, we're diving into one of the most disturbing family secrets ever uncovered in American history. This is the story of the Durnham family of Millbrook, Connecticut, and the horrifying discovery that would shake a small New England town to its core. But before we begin, I need to warn you. This story contains elements that some viewers may find deeply disturbing. What the Durnham family concealed behind those walls defies explanation, and the truth they tried so desperately to bury would ultimately consume them all. If you're sensitive to discussions of violence against children or ritual murder, you may want to stop watching now. For everyone else, prepare yourself for a journey into one of America's darkest family secrets. Meet Sarah Collins, a 28-year-old freelance journalist from Boston who specialized in writing about historical mysteries and unsolved crimes. She had built a modest reputation investigating cold cases for true crime magazines, but nothing in her career had prepared her for what she would discover on October 15, 2019, when she inherited something she never expected: a massive Victorian mansion from her great-aunt Margaret Durnham, a woman she'd only met twice in her entire life. The first meeting had been at Sarah's college graduation in 2013. Margaret had appeared out of nowhere, an elegant elderly woman with piercing blue eyes and an unsettling smile. She'd congratulated Sarah on her journalism degree and made an odd comment that would stick with her for years. The truth has a way of finding those brave enough to seek it, dear. Remember that. The second and final meeting was at Margaret's funeral just 2 weeks before Sarah received the inheritance papers. Margaret Durnham had been the last surviving member of one of Millbrook's oldest and most influential families. The Durnhams had built their fortune in the textile industry during the late 1800s, constructing their sprawling estate on Elm Street in 1887. The three-story Victorian mansion sat on 12 acres of prime Connecticut real estate, complete with servant quarters, a carriage house, and elaborate gardens that had once been the pride of the community. For over 130 years, the family had lived in that house, wielding considerable influence over the small town's economy and politics. The Durnham textile mill had employed nearly half the town at its peak, and even after its closure in the 1960s, the family's wealth continued to support local businesses and charities. Margaret's death left the house empty for the first time since its construction, and with it, the end of an era that few in Millbrook were sorry to see conclude. Sarah had planned to sell the property immediately. After all, she lived in a cramped studio apartment in Boston's North End, had no ties to Millbrook, and the maintenance costs for a 12-room mansion would bankrupt her freelance income within months. The property taxes alone were more than she made in a quarter. But when she arrived to assess the property on that cold October afternoon, she discovered something that would change everything. The house felt wrong from the moment she stepped out of her Honda Civic. The October sky was overcast, casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn. But there was something more than weather creating the oppressive atmosphere. The mansion loomed before her like something from a Gothic novel, its dark windows seeming to watch her approach. The realtor had warned her that the house had been empty for months, that Margaret had lived alone in her final years with only a part-time caretaker, but nothing had prepared her for the overwhelming sense of malevolence that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The house felt wrong. I know that sounds crazy, but from the moment I stepped inside, there was this oppressive atmosphere. Like the walls themselves were watching me. The air was thick and stagnant, despite the October chill outside, and there was this underlying current of, I don't know how to describe it, fear, guilt, and the smell. God, the smell was awful, like something had died and been left to rot, but also something chemical, medicinal. It made my stomach turn. The interior was a time capsule of wealth and decay. Heavy velvet curtains blocked most of the natural light, casting the rooms in perpetual twilight. Dust sheets covered most of the furniture, but what Sarah could see spoke of a family that had spared no expense in their decorating. Persian rugs, crystal chandeliers, and oil paintings in gilded frames adorned every room. But there was something off about it all, something that made Sarah's journalist instincts prickle with unease. But Sarah was a journalist, and journalists follow their instincts. Instead of leaving and returning with the realtor as planned, she decided to stay the night and explore the house thoroughly. She'd brought a sleeping bag and camping supplies, thinking she might need to stay overnight if the assessment took longer than expected. It was a decision that would haunt her forever, but would also expose a truth that had been buried for nearly a century. Sarah's exploration began on the first floor, where she found the typical rooms of a grand Victorian home. A formal parlor with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a dining room that could seat 20, a kitchen that had been updated sometime in the 1950s, but retained its original massive cast-iron stove. But it was in the study that she found her first clue that something was amiss. The desk drawers were locked, but one had been forced open recently, its contents scattered. Among the papers, she found correspondence dating back decades, all addressed to the keeper, and signed with various initials rather than full names. The letters spoke in coded language about deliveries and ceremonies and the continuation of traditions. One letter, dated 1994, was more explicit. The Thomas arrives next month. All preparations have been made according to the ancient protocols. The family is eager to proceed with the harvest. Sarah photographed everything with her phone, her hands shaking as she began to understand that she had stumbled onto something far more sinister than a simple inheritance. The second floor contained the bedrooms, and it was here that Sarah made her most disturbing discovery yet. Family portraits spanning 5 generations lined the hallway, but with one peculiar detail that made her blood run cold. Every single portrait, going back to the 1880s, showed families with an odd number of children, but in each photo you could see faint outlines like someone had been deliberately removed from the pictures, cut out, erased. The missing figures weren't random. In every single portrait, it was always one child, always appearing to be between the ages of 12 and 16. And always the family members remaining in the photos had the same expression, a mixture of grief and guilt that seemed to transcend the limitations of photography. But there was something else in their eyes too, something that chilled Sarah to the bone. Satisfaction, as if they had gained something from the missing child's absence. She spent hours examining each portrait, taking detailed photographs and notes. The earliest showed Jeremiah Durnham, the family patriarch, with his wife Constance and their 4 children. But the outline of a 5th child was clearly visible, carefully cut away with surgical precision. The pattern continued through every generation, children removed, families incomplete, and always that same expression of guilty satisfaction on the surviving members' faces. It was on the 3rd floor, in what appeared to be a child's bedroom, that Sarah made her first significant discovery. The room was different from the others, more recently maintained, despite its obviously aged decor. The wallpaper was a cheerful pattern of sailboats and anchors, clearly chosen for a young boy, but the overall atmosphere was deeply unsettling. While examining the walls more closely, she noticed a section near the window that seemed slightly different, less faded, as if it had been replaced more recently than the rest. I pressed against it, and I could feel it give way slightly. There was definitely something behind there, some kind of hollow space. I went downstairs and found a kitchen knife, then came back and carefully cut through the wallpaper. I was expecting maybe old newspapers or insulation, something normal. What I found underneath, I still have nightmares about it. Behind the wallpaper was a small alcove, roughly 3 feet by 3 feet and about 2 feet deep. And inside that alcove was a collection of items that told a story no family should ever have to tell. Children's clothing from different time periods, carefully folded and preserved. A collection of diaries dating back to 1926, their leather covers worn but still intact. And most disturbingly, dozens of photographs showing children who appeared to match the missing figures from the family portraits downstairs. The clothes were in perfect condition, preserved somehow against the ravages of time. There were knickers and suspenders from the 1920s, dungarees from the 1940s, bell-bottom jeans from the 1970s, and more modern clothing from recent decades. Each set was carefully labeled with dates and a name, Thomas. And the diaries, they all had the same name written inside the cover in different handwriting styles. Thomas, but they spanned decades. Thomas from 1926, Thomas from 1941, Thomas from 1967, Thomas from 1984, Thomas from 2003. Sarah sat on the floor of that child's bedroom, surrounded by the evidence of something impossible. How could someone named Thomas have been writing diaries for over 80 years? And why had the Durnham family been hiding these belongings? As a journalist, she knew she had to investigate further, but every instinct was screaming at her to leave immediately. The house seemed to be pressing in on her, and she could swear she heard footsteps in the hallway, though she knew she was alone. Fighting her fear, she opened the oldest diary, dated 1926. The handwriting was that of a child, careful and precise in the way that suggested formal education. The diaries revealed a pattern that was both impossible and terrifying. Each one told the story of a boy named Thomas, who lived with the Durnham family for exactly 1 year, from his 12th birthday until his 13th. March 15th, 1926. Today is my 12th birthday, and the Durnhams have welcomed me into their home. They say I'm part of the family now, but Mother and Father warned me never to tell anyone where I came from. They say it's for my own protection. Mr. Durnham gave me this diary and said I should write in it every day to record my thoughts and experiences. He says it's important for the family history. The entries that followed painted a picture of a family that was loving and caring, but with strange rules and rituals that the children were expected to follow without question. The boy wrote about lavish meals, expensive clothes, tutoring in subjects that seemed advanced for his age, but there were also disturbing elements that became more apparent as Sarah read deeper into the diary. March 28th, 1926. We're not allowed in the basement. Mr. Durnham says there are dangerous chemicals down there from his textile work, but I heard strange sounds coming from down there last night, like chanting or singing. Mrs. Durnham makes me special meals, different from what the other children eat. She says I need to stay strong and healthy. She also gives me these bitter pills every morning that make me feel strange and drowsy. April 10th, 1926. The other children don't talk to me much. When I try to play with them, they get this scared look in their eyes and walk away. Margaret, who's about my age, told me yesterday that I shouldn't get too comfortable here. When I asked her what she meant, she just said, "You'll understand when it's time." I don't know what she's talking about, but it makes me nervous. The diary entries continued for months, documenting a year of privilege mixed with increasing unease. The boy wrote about feeling isolated, about strange dreams that felt more like visions, about a growing sense that something terrible was being planned for him. And then, abruptly, the entries stopped with a final, chilling note. March 14th, 1927. Tomorrow is my 13th birthday. Mr. Durnham says it's time for me to join the family permanently. I don't know what he means, but I'm scared. If anyone finds this diary, please tell my parents I love them. Armed with this new knowledge, Sarah began a systematic search of the entire house, looking for more hidden compartments. What she found was a network of concealed spaces throughout the mansion, each one containing similar collections. Clothes, diaries, and photographs of different boys, all named Thomas, spanning nearly a century. The pattern was precise and methodical, suggesting a level of organization that spoke to generational planning. Every 17 years, like clockwork, a new Thomas would arrive at the Durnham house on his 12th birthday. For exactly 1 year, he would live as part of the family, treated with kindness and luxury while being prepared for something that the diaries never explicitly described, but that filled each boy with increasing dread as his 13th birthday approached. And then, the diary entries would stop. I found evidence of 6 different Thomas boys over 93 years. 1926, 1943, 1960, 1977, 1994, and 2011, each cycle lasting exactly 1 year, each ending the same way, with an abrupt final entry that simply said, "It's time." The mathematical precision was terrifying. This wasn't random violence or crimes of passion. This was systematic, planned, ritualistic. By now it was well past midnight, and Sarah knew she should leave, call the police, turn this horror over to someone else. But her journalist instincts were in full control now. She had stumbled onto the story of a lifetime, and she couldn't walk away without understanding the full scope of what had happened in this house. Against her better judgment, she decided to drive into town and try to find someone who might have answers. Desperate for answers, Sarah drove into Millbrook proper as the sun was rising, hoping to find an early opening diner or coffee shop where she might strike up conversations with locals. What she discovered was a town that had been keeping the Durnham family's secret for generations, and whose residents seemed genuinely afraid to discuss anything related to the family. The first person she approached was Harold Pemberton, a 78-year-old man she found feeding pigeons in the town square. When she mentioned the Durnham house, his face went pale and he looked around nervously, as if afraid someone might be listening. Everyone knew. The whole damn town knew, but nobody talked about it. My grandfather told me, his father told him. The Durnhams, they weren't like other folks. There was something unnatural about them, something that went back generations. And those boys they took in, well, they came from families who owed the Durnhams money, families who had nowhere else to turn. Harold's revelation opened a floodgate of information that painted a picture of systematic exploitation spanning more than a century. The Durnham family, it turned out, had been the primary source of employment in Millbrook for generations. When families fell into debt, which happened frequently during economic downturns like the Great Depression, the economic panics of the 1890s, or more recently the recession of 2008, the Durnhams would make them an offer they couldn't refuse. They'd forgive the debt completely, sometimes thousands of dollars, but in exchange, the family had to give up their youngest son when he turned 12. Just for a year, they said. Just until he turned 13. The boy would be educated, fed, clothed, and treated like a member of the family. After his 13th birthday, they claimed, he would be returned with enough money to set him up for life. And the families, they were so desperate, they agreed. But Harold's story took an even darker turn as he revealed what happened to families who refused the Durnhams' offer. Mysterious accidents, house fires, business failures that seemed to target anyone who crossed the family. The message was clear. Cooperation meant survival. Resistance meant destruction. Over the decades, the town had learned to simply look the other way when the Durnhams made their periodic requests for temporary guardianship. But Sarah's research revealed something even more disturbing when she visited the town clerk's office and examined the official records. She found reports of missing children, always boys, always around age 13, always from families that had worked for the Durnhams. The pattern went back decades, with reports filed by desperate parents who claimed their sons had vanished without a trace. The reports were filed, but they were never investigated. The sheriff's department would mark them as runaways and close the cases within 48 hours, every single time. I found documentation going back to the 1940s showing the same pattern. A boy would disappear, parents would file a missing person report, and within 2 days, the case would be closed with a notation that the child had run away to seek his fortune in the big city. What made this even more suspicious was that these supposed runaways never contacted their families again, never sent letters or made phone calls, never surfaced anywhere else in the country. In an age before social media, it might have been possible for someone to disappear completely, but the sheer number of cases and their consistent timing suggested something far more sinister than teenage rebellion. Sarah spent the entire day in the town hall, photographing documents and building a timeline of disappearances that corresponded exactly with the dates she'd found in the hidden diaries. 6 boys over 93 years, each vanishing just after their 13th birthday. Each disappearance officially dismissed as a runaway case despite the protestations of their families. Despite every instinct telling her to leave, to call the FBI and turn this evidence over to professionals, Sarah knew she had to see what the Durnhams had hidden in the basement. The diaries all mentioned the basement as forbidden territory, and every investigation she'd ever conducted had taught her that the most important evidence was always found in the places people tried hardest to hide. Using a crowbar she found in the carriage house, she broke through the multiple locks that secured the basement door. The locks themselves told a story, layers of security added over the decades, from simple padlocks to modern deadbolts, to what appeared to be a custom-made steel bar that required considerable effort to remove. Whatever was down there, the Durnhams had been very serious about keeping people out. The stairs were steep and narrow, and the smell that had permeated the entire house was overwhelming here at its source. Sarah descended slowly, her flashlight cutting through the darkness to reveal something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. What she found defied every rational explanation. The basement had been converted into something that resembled a combination medieval laboratory and ritual chamber. The walls were lined with stone, clearly added long after the house's original construction. Stone tables with channels carved into their surfaces dominated the center of the room, and surgical instruments from different time periods hung from hooks on the walls, like some macabre museum display. There were charts on the walls, anatomical drawings that seemed to focus on the circulatory and nervous systems, and in the center of the room was this massive stone altar with channels carved into it, leading to drains in the floor. The whole place reeked of death and chemicals, but also something else, something that reminded me of a hospital operating room. Antiseptic and sterile, but underneath it all, the unmistakable smell of decay. But the most horrifying discovery was a series of journals belonging to different generations of Durnhams, carefully preserved in glass cases like precious artifacts. These weren't hidden away like the boys' diaries upstairs. They were proudly displayed on specially built shelves, chronicling a family tradition that had continued for nearly a century. The boy arrived today, Thomas number 6. He is strong and healthy, just as the others were. The preparation year begins now. Father says the ritual must be performed on the anniversary of his arrival, when the moon is dark and the veil between worlds is thinnest. It is the only way to ensure our family's continued prosperity and longevity. The old ways must be preserved. The journals revealed the Durnhams' belief in a ritual that they claimed would transfer the life force of young boys to the family members, ensuring their longevity and prosperity. But these weren't the ravings of madmen. The entries were methodical, scientific, detailing preparations and procedures with the precision of medical textbooks. They spoke of harvesting techniques, developed over generations, of preservation methods that ensured maximum essence extraction. Each journal entry detailed preparations for what they called the harvest, a ceremony that apparently took place exactly 1 year after each boy's arrival. The rituals were described in clinical detail, involving procedures that were clearly designed to slowly drain the life from the victim while keeping them alive as long as possible. The Durnhams believed that fear and suffering enhanced the potency of what they were stealing, so the final ritual was designed to maximize both. But perhaps most disturbing was the way the journals documented the effects of their ceremonies. Each generation of Durnhams lived far longer than should have been possible, remained healthy and vital well into ages that should have been impossible for their time periods. The first Thomas, sacrificed in 1927, had apparently granted the family an additional 20 years of life. The second had renewed this gift, and so on through the generations. Sarah's great-aunt Margaret, the woman who had left her the house, had been born in 1924. According to the family journals, she should have died decades ago from natural causes, but the records showed something impossible. Margaret had somehow lived to be 95 years old, despite multiple family members claiming she looked barely 60 when she died. I started doing the math, and it didn't add up. If the ritual worked the way the journals described, Margaret would have participated in at least 4 of the ceremonies. She would have been there when Thomas number 2 disappeared in 1943, number 3 in 1960, number 4 in 1977, and number 5 in 1994. She would have been an active participant in the murder of 4 children. Hospital records that Sarah obtained showed that Margaret had never been seriously ill, never showed signs of aging-related diseases, and had died peacefully in her sleep with no apparent cause of death. For someone born in 1924, this was statistically impossible. The average life expectancy for women born in that era was around 65 years, and very few lived past 85 without significant health problems. But the most chilling discovery was Margaret's personal journal, found in a locked drawer of an antique secretary desk in the basement. The last entry was dated just 3 days before she died and revealed why Sarah had inherited the house. I can feel them calling to me, all the Thomas boys. Their spirits have been growing stronger as I grow weaker. They want justice, and I'm too tired to fight them anymore. The guilt has been eating at me for decades, but the family traditions were too strong to break. Perhaps it's time the truth came out. I'm leaving the house to Sarah, my brother's granddaughter, She's a journalist, a seeker of truth. If anyone can expose what we've done and give those boys the justice they deserve, it's her. The most recent Thomas had disappeared in 2012. Thomas Williams, age 13, whose family had lost their home in the 2008 financial crisis and had been working for the Durnhams as caretakers. Unlike the others, Thomas Williams had a sister who never stopped looking for him. A sister who had spent the last decade trying to uncover the truth about his disappearance. I was 16 when Tommy disappeared. The police said he ran away, but Tommy wouldn't do that. He was scared of the dark. He wouldn't have left on his own at night. And he was excited about starting high school the next fall. He had made plans with his friends. I knew the Durnhams had something to do with it, but nobody would listen to me. They were too powerful, too connected. Jenny Williams had spent the last decade investigating her brother's disappearance, compiling evidence that the police had ignored and building a case that no one in authority wanted to hear. She had tracked down other families whose children had disappeared, documented the pattern of cover-ups, and even attempted to search the Durnham property before being arrested for trespassing. When Sarah contacted her after finding Tommy's diary in the house, the two women joined forces to finally expose the truth. Jenny's evidence filled in gaps in Sarah's discoveries, and together they built an irrefutable case against the Durnham family and their conspirators. Sarah's discovery confirmed everything I'd suspected. The Durnhams weren't just taking these boys, they were murdering them in ritualistic ceremonies, and the whole town was complicit, from the sheriff's department to the mayor's office to the local newspaper that never reported on the disappearances. Armed with decades of evidence, photographs of the basement chamber, the preserved diaries, and testimony from Jenny Williams, Sarah and Jenny decided to perform one final search of the basement to find conclusive proof. Using ground-penetrating radar equipment that Jenny had borrowed from a friend who worked in construction, they scanned the basement floor and found what they were looking for. Behind a false wall that had been constructed sometime in the 1940s, we found them. 6 sets of remains, each carefully preserved and labeled with dates corresponding to the disappearances. They were arranged like trophies in display cases. Each skeleton showed evidence of trauma consistent with the ritual procedures described in the journals. The discovery was more horrifying than either woman had imagined. The remains weren't simply buried or hidden. They had been carefully preserved using techniques that the Durnhams had developed over the decades, treated with chemicals that prevented decomposition, and arranged in positions that suggested they were meant to be viewed and revered rather than forgotten. Each set of remains was accompanied by personal effects. The clothes the boys had been wearing, items from their previous lives, and in some cases, final letters they had been forced to write to their families explaining their decision to run away. The letters were clearly written under duress, with handwriting that became increasingly shaky and desperate as the boys realized what was actually happening to them. Sarah immediately contacted the FBI, bypassing local law enforcement entirely given the evidence of their complicity in the cover-up. Federal agents arrived within hours and began what would become the largest criminal investigation in Connecticut's history. The evidence was overwhelming. The Durnham family had been operating a ritualistic murder cult for nearly a century, with the full knowledge and cooperation of significant portions of the local community. In 40 years of law enforcement, I've never seen anything like this. The level of organization, the documentation, the community-wide cover-up, it represents one of the most elaborate serial killing operations in American history. The fact that it continued for nearly a century with multiple generations participating shows a level of systematic evil that defies comprehension. The investigation revealed that while Margaret was the last surviving Durnham, several town officials and business leaders had been aware of the family's crimes and had actively helped cover them up. The sheriff's department had been taking payments from the family for decades to ensure that missing person cases were never properly investigated. The mayor's office had been complicit in zoning decisions that kept other development away from the Durnham property. Even the local newspaper had been paid to suppress stories about the disappearances. 17 people were arrested in connection with the murders and conspiracy, ranging from current and former law enforcement officers to business leaders who had helped facilitate the cover-up. The trials that followed revealed the full scope of the horror and the mechanisms by which an entire community had been corrupted by fear, greed, and willful blindness. The trials revealed the full scope of the horror that had been hidden in Millbrook for nearly a century. The Durnhams had convinced themselves that their rituals were necessary to maintain their family's success and the town's prosperity. They genuinely believed they were performing a service, not committing murder. The defense attorneys tried to argue that the family had been operating under generations of mental illness, but the evidence showed careful planning and deliberate choices made by rational people who simply valued their own comfort over the lives of children. We were told it was for the greater good, that the sacrifice of these boys kept the whole town employed and prosperous. The Durnhams convinced us that their rituals were preventing greater disasters, that without them the town would face economic collapse, natural disasters, and social chaos. When you're desperate and someone offers you a simple solution to complex problems, you want to believe them, even when that solution involves looking the other way when children disappear. Harold Pemberton's testimony revealed how the conspiracy had been maintained across generations. Each family that participated was bound by guilt and fear, knowing that exposing the truth would implicate them as accessories to murder. The Durnhams had created a perfect system of mutual assured destruction, where everyone involved had too much to lose to break the silence. Sarah donated the mansion to the families of the victims, who decided to have it completely demolished after the investigation was complete. The basement chamber was filled with concrete, and the entire structure was raised to ensure that no trace of the horror remained. In its place, they built a memorial garden with 6 headstones bearing the names of the murdered boys. I couldn't keep the house. Even after everything was removed, after the FBI had processed every inch of it as a crime scene, I could still feel their presence. Those boys deserved better than to have their memory tied to that place of horror. They deserved a peaceful resting place where people could come to remember them as the children they were, not as victims of an evil family's delusions. The town of Millbrook underwent a complete transformation in the aftermath of the investigation. New leadership was elected after the mayor and several city council members were arrested. A victims fund was established using money seized from Durnham family assets, providing financial support for the families and funding for a comprehensive mental health program for the community. But for many residents, the shame of their community's complicity would never fully heal. Justice for Tommy and the other boys was important, but it doesn't bring them back. What matters now is making sure something like this never happens again. We have to teach people to speak up when they see injustice, even when it's easier to look the other way. We have to create systems where vulnerable people can't be silenced or ignored. The FBI's investigation expanded far beyond Millbrook when they discovered correspondence between the Durnhams and other families across New England. The letters found in Margaret's personal files revealed a network of like-minded individuals who had been sharing information and supporting each other's activities for decades. Archaeological teams began excavating properties connected to these families, searching for additional victims. We've identified at least 12 other properties where similar activities may have taken place. This wasn't just one family's madness. It appears to have been part of a broader network of ritualistic killers operating across multiple states. The correspondence shows that these families were in regular contact, sharing techniques and justifications for their actions. The Durnham family had been corresponding with families in Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and even as far away as Maine and Rhode Island. The letters revealed a subculture that had existed parallel to normal society for over a century, built around the shared belief that human sacrifice was necessary for prosperity and longevity. What we discovered in Millbrook was just the tip of the iceberg. These families had created an entire mythology around their actions, complete with elaborate rituals, sacred texts, and annual gatherings where they would share their experiences and plan future activities. They had books passed down through generations, detailing procedures and justifications. They genuinely believed they were part of something sacred, not criminal. The investigation uncovered evidence of similar disappearances in Vermont, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts dating back to the early 1900s. Police departments across New England began reopening cold cases, looking for patterns that matched what had been discovered in Millbrook. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering, involving dozens of families and potentially hundreds of victims over more than a century. Dr. Elizabeth Carter, a criminal psychologist brought in to analyze the case, provided insight into how such a systematic pattern of murder could continue for so long without detection. The Durnham case represents a unique form of multi-generational folie à plusieurs, a shared psychotic disorder that affected not just the immediate family, but an entire community. The economic dependency created a perfect storm for this type of mass delusion. When people's survival depends on a single family's generosity, they become willing to ignore even the most heinous crimes. Dr. Carter's analysis revealed how economic desperation had made the town vulnerable to the Durnhams' influence. During economic downturns, when families faced losing their homes and livelihoods, the Durnhams positioned themselves as saviors while simultaneously being the source of the community's problems. This created a cycle of dependency that made resistance nearly impossible. The most disturbing aspect is how the rituals became normalized over time. Each generation was raised to believe that these murders were not only acceptable, but necessary. Children grew up knowing that certain boys would disappear, and they learned not to ask questions. It shows how easily moral boundaries can be eroded when they conflict with survival instincts. Interviews with arrested conspirators revealed a common psychological pattern. They had convinced themselves that the boys weren't really being murdered, but were being transformed into something greater. This delusion allowed them to participate without feeling the full weight of their guilt, creating a mental framework where they could see themselves as participants in something sacred rather than accessories to murder. News of the Millbrook discoveries sent shockwaves through small communities across New England. Police departments began reopening cold cases involving missing children, looking for patterns similar to what Sarah had uncovered. The revelation that an entire town could be complicit in serial murder for nearly a century forced law enforcement agencies to reconsider how they investigated disappearances in small, economically dependent communities. We've identified at least 30 unsolved disappearances that match the Millbrook pattern. Boys between 12 and 14, from financially struggling families, all reported as runaways with minimal investigation conducted by local law enforcement. We're treating each case as a potential homicide now, and we're bringing in federal resources to ensure that local politics can't interfere with the investigations. The investigation revealed that the network of families called themselves the Keepers of Prosperity and believed they were following ancient traditions necessary for maintaining social order. They had created elaborate justifications for their actions, drawing on corrupted interpretations of various religious and occult traditions to convince themselves that what they were doing was not only acceptable but necessary for the greater good. They had created an entire mythology around their actions, complete with books passed down through generations, detailing rituals and justifications. They genuinely believed they were part of something sacred, not criminal. The level of organization and the sophistication of their belief system shows that this wasn't random violence or crimes of passion, but a carefully constructed ideology that had been refined over multiple generations. The revelation of the murders devastated the families of the victims, but it also brought unexpected relief to some. Parents who had blamed themselves for their children's disappearances finally learned the truth about what had happened, and the knowledge that their children had been victims of a deliberate conspiracy rather than their own failures as parents provided a complicated form of closure. For 40 years, I blamed myself. I thought maybe if I had been a better mother, if I had paid more attention, if I had fought harder against giving Tommy to the Durnhams, he wouldn't have disappeared. Finding out he was murdered was horrible, but knowing it wasn't my fault, that there was nothing I could have done to prevent it, that gave me some peace. It doesn't bring him back, but it lets me stop hating myself. Support groups were established for the families, providing counseling and resources to help them process the trauma of learning their children had been victims of a deliberate conspiracy. The groups also served as advocacy organizations, working to ensure that the investigation continued and that similar cases in other communities would be thoroughly investigated. Meeting the other families was both heartbreaking and healing. We all carried the same guilt, the same questions, the same anger at a system that had failed our children. Finally, having answers, even terrible ones, was better than living with uncertainty. And working together to make sure this never happens again gives us a way to honor our children's memory. The Durnham case sparked a national conversation about how economic inequality can create conditions for widespread corruption and abuse. The story went viral on social media, with millions of people expressing shock that an entire community could be complicit in serial murder. But it also prompted serious discussions about the vulnerability of economically dependent communities and the need for better oversight of powerful families and institutions. Congressional hearings were held to examine how federal agencies could better identify and investigate cases where economic dependency might be hiding systematic abuse. The hearings revealed that the FBI had protocols for investigating organized crime and terrorism, but lacked specific procedures for dealing with community-wide conspiracies involving ritual murder. The Millbrook case shows us that we cannot rely solely on local law enforcement when investigating serious crimes. Economic pressure can compromise even the most well-intentioned officials, and federal oversight is necessary when entire communities may be complicit in covering up crimes. We need new protocols that automatically trigger federal involvement when certain patterns are detected. New protocols were established for investigating missing children in economically distressed communities, with mandatory federal oversight when local investigations are closed quickly or when patterns suggest systematic cover-ups. Law enforcement agencies across the country receive new training on identifying signs of community-wide conspiracies and cult-like behavior. The FBI established a special task force dedicated to investigating similar cases nationwide, with a focus on identifying communities where economic dependency might be hiding systematic abuse. The task force has already identified several communities where similar patterns of disappearances and cover-ups may indicate ongoing criminal activity. People ask me if I regret inheriting that house, if I wish I had never learned the truth. But those boys deserve to have their story told. They deserve justice, even if it came too late. And their families deserve to know what really happened, deserve to stop blaming themselves for something that was completely beyond their control. Thomas Harper, 1926. Thomas Kellerman, 1943. Thomas Rodriguez, 1960. Thomas Johnson, 1977. Thomas Chen, 1994. Thomas Williams, 2011. 6 boys whose lives were cut short by a family's delusions of grandeur and a community's willingness to look the other way. Each one was someone's son, someone's brother, someone's hope for the future. The hardest part is knowing that this could happen again. Anywhere there's extreme economic inequality and desperation, people become vulnerable to this kind of manipulation. We have to stay vigilant, we have to speak up when we see injustice, and we have to create systems that protect the vulnerable instead of exploiting them. Today, the Memorial Garden in Millbrook serves as a reminder of what can happen when communities prioritize economic survival over moral responsibility. Visitors from around the world come to pay their respects and to remember the importance of speaking up against injustice, no matter the cost. The garden is maintained by volunteers from the community, people who want to honor the victims and ensure that their story is never forgotten. I come here every year on his birthday. I tell him about my life, about the justice we finally got for him and the others, about the changes that have been made because of his story. I think he would be proud that his death wasn't meaningless, that it helped prevent this from happening to other kids. It doesn't make up for losing him, but it gives his death some meaning. The macabre history of the Durnham family serves as a chilling reminder that evil can flourish in the most unexpected places, hidden behind facades of respectability and tradition. But it also shows us that truth, no matter how deeply buried, will eventually find a way to surface. The courage of one journalist who refused to ignore what she had discovered, combined with the determination of a sister who never stopped looking for answers, brought justice to 6 murdered children and exposed a conspiracy that had hidden in plain sight for nearly a century. The walls that concealed the Durnhams' secrets for 93 years have finally fallen, and the boys they tried to erase from history will never be forgotten again. Their names are carved in stone in the Memorial Garden, and their story serves as a warning about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of protecting the vulnerable members of our society. The Thomas boys may be gone, but their legacy lives on in the changes their story has brought about and the lives it may save in the future.